Welcome to the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and I interview business leaders who are committed to their own growth and the development of everyone on their team. If you enjoy my podcast, be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. Welcome back to another episode of the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell. And today we're going to explore a skill that is really critical for every person to be successful in life, and that's the ability to make good decisions. My guest today is co-author of the best book I've ever read on this topic, and I'm excited to bring her expertise and experience to you. So I want to welcome to my podcast, Kandis Porter. Hi, Kandis.
Hi, Meredith. Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, I am just so looking forward to this conversation because I can't think of a single area of life where decision-making isn't important. You know, at work, in our personal lives, just so many choices that we're faced with throughout our lives. And I want to give a big shout out to Damon Lembi, our good friend and your co-author of the book, which is Good Decisions Equal Success. And I just so enjoyed reading this and looking forward to diving into it with you. But first, let me tell my audience a little bit about you. Kandis is the founder and CEO of Effective Flow Connections, a management consulting company that helps transform organizations through strategic planning, project management, process improvement, change management, and training. Kandis also works one-on-one with clients, focusing on leadership development and growth. And one of the things I enjoyed so much, Kandis, was reading about your own journey in this whole area of learning how to make good decisions. And you tell some wonderful stories. I'd love for you to give us a little bit of your background. It's so diverse and extensive about what really sparked your interest in this whole topic.
Thank you, Meredith. And I have to say, I feel like a cat with 9 lives sometimes, because when I look back on my journey over the years, I feel like there has been endless learning. And a lot of times you're learning from maybe making decisions that didn't go so well. And then other times, maybe going through a process where it went very smoothly. And I think all of it's just fantastic learning opportunities. I think we learn a lot more through experience. And so that's a lot of what Damon and I tried to do, was bring real world stuff into our book and then have really tactical recommendations on how people can apply it. So I'll start out by saying, I moved away from home, which is Missouri, when I was just 17 years old. I graduated from high school at a young age and moved to Kansas City, where I spent the next couple of years getting my Associate of Arts degree. And then I decided at age 19 to join active duty Air Force. And I'll tell you, that was probably the biggest decision that I had to make in my life up to that point. And I did a lot of information gathering and at the time doing the best I could with weighing pros and cons. I talked to a couple of people, especially females that had served active duty military, because I really didn't know much about it. What was my life going to look like? And so that was kind of the beginning of making a high impact decision, which I will say was one of the best decisions that I've ever made, was going active duty Air Force. And from there, they offer fantastic training, and decision making and risk management is one of the areas that I think our Department of Defense is really, really good at. So over the years, through some training, again, through experiences, I'd say that's really what sparked my love for thinking about decisions and thinking about how we think about decisions. I'll add to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and now you've had your own consulting firm for several years, and you are helping clients with that whole area of decision making. And, one of the things that I think happens, I know I've been guilty of it, is we get our emotions involved. And I enjoyed reading some of the instances where you and Damon both described situations where you really focused on how you felt about it and didn't factor in that front brain or logical aspect. So, why does deciding from our gut alone get us into trouble?
You know, I think it's important to acknowledge emotions. So when we talk about not making emotion driven decisions, it's still okay to acknowledge them. But oftentimes, when we're making emotional decisions, we're doing it quickly. And you mentioned kind of from our gut. In our book, our majority of the focus, I'll say, is on high impact decisions. And when we're talking about high impact, so maybe life changing or major changes within your organization or your team, we need to make sure that we're looking at the data. And that's just the bottom line. We need to shift into our executive level thinking where we're gathering data, even if we think we know the best way to move forward. Does the data support it? And emotional decisions, it just tends to get us into trouble. So if your gut is telling you something, you might be right, but try to get that data to really justify and confirm that that is the best approach.
Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes people can get into being overly analytical and not pay attention to their gut. So there's that other side too, where if we ignore those emotions and don't take those into consideration along with the data, then we could run into problems making a bad decision on that side as well. Have you seen that happen too?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've seen where people get stuck in analysis paralysis, where they want to just go so deep into the data and there's just never enough of it to where you draw the line and move forward. And so I'll add to this, and this is where decision making it continues to get more and more complex. I'll add to that timely decisions are important as well. So we can't gather so much information that it overwhelms us, and we can't totally ignore our emotions because guess what? People are involved and impacted by decisions. And so if we are pushing emotions completely aside, there's a good chance that we can make the best decision in the world based on the data at hand. But if people don't embrace it, if it's not implemented well, then we're not going to see any return on investment. And so as you can see, it's kind of like this big swirl. We need to acknowledge our emotions, but not make decisions based purely on those emotions. We need to gather data, but not too much data. But then we also have to put ourselves in the shoes of the people that are going to be impacted by decisions and think about what's in it for me from their standpoint. And also consider, how do we communicate this? How do we implement it well? And so forth. So generally with a high impact decision, there's more than one person impacted by it.
Yes. And one of my favorite parts, because I had never thought of decision making like this, was looking at the roles, the DIDI model that you had. And I would love for you to talk about that because for folks listening to this, I would like you to think about a decision that impacts multiple people, whether it's in your family or in your work environment, your team, or the entire company. I think this model that you and Damon have laid out is really valuable for thinking through what you were just talking about. So tell us about those different roles.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned earlier, I work very closely consulting to a lot of organizations of different sizes. And this is one of the areas that I find they struggle most with. So sometimes I'll hear from senior leaders that, hey, we really need our mid or senior level managers to be taking initiative and empowered to make decisions and to drive them forward. And then sometimes we'll hear from the mid and the senior level managers, well, I don't know where that authority lies. Like, do I have the authority to make the decision? Or am I going to get hammered if I make a not so great decision? And so it seems to be this conversation going on where the roles aren't clearly laid out. So the DIDI model, I think, is a pretty simple one. And I think it's something that needs to find very early on in the decision-making process. So as we're defining the intent of the decision, we also need to define those roles. So the first D, it stands for decision maker. And I want to say that really comes down to the authority. Who has the authority to say, yes, we're moving in this decision direction, and we're going to apply resources and make this happen. So decision maker is the first one, a very important role. And this could be multiple people. So it could be an entire board of directors where we need majority. It could be a leadership team, or it could be one individual. So that's our first D. Our next letter is I, and that's for input. We need to make sure that we're talking to the right people during the decision-making process and getting input from them. So a lot of times we have some subject matter experts such as HR, legal, maybe managers where we know that they will be impacted by a decision or their teams will be impacted. So we want to get that input. The next D, this is where I would say I see the most confusion, the driver of the decision. So Meredith, if I worked for you and you were the decision maker, so you have the authority to make the decision, you may say, Kandis, I want you to drive forward the decision-making process for this high impact decision. So I want you to go out, talk to all the people providing input, come up with some recommendations. I want you to bring me 3 recommendations with, here's our first course of action, our second, and our third. And then you're ultimately going to make the decision. So defining the driver, which could sometimes be the decision maker, but defining them separately because they're not always. And I've seen people that were designated as the driver of the decision who ultimately thought they were making the decision. And so they then present it to their boss. So if I presented something to you and said, this is the direction we're going, you may say, nope, we're not. Next option. And that leads to a lot of frustration and resistance when that happens within an organization. I'll then close with the last letter, the last I, which is implementer. And this is such a critical role because we can make the best decision if it's not implemented well, if it doesn't get buy-in, if it doesn't, get traction within an organization or our personal life, then we didn't do a good job. Oftentimes, large projects or decisions are implemented by maybe a formal chartered project. Mm-hmm. So we may have a project manager who's serving as that implementer. So those are kind of the different roles: decision maker, input, driver of the decision-making process, and then our implementer.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. And you gave the example of in meetings where you think there's been a decision and then weeks go by and nobody's done anything because you didn't have the clear either driver or implementer or both identified who's doing what and by when. Those kinds of things just lead to the lack of communication and frustration that people often experience when they think something's going to happen, but it doesn't. And that lack of clarity. There's so many times that I think we make assumptions about what people have understood when we haven't taken the time to really clarify that with them. And so there are areas of confusion. What are some of the issues you see happening with clients you work with that maybe would be helpful for my listeners to hear about? Areas where they get into problems without clarifying these 4 roles and what happens on the downside as a result of that.
I'll go ahead and pick up where you pointed to, which is, let's say we are in a decision-making meeting and the decision maker or makers just made a decision. If everyone says, yeah, let's move on and leaves that room, that is going to be a big problem because then everyone is left to their own devices to tell the story of what happened in that room. No one really knows who's doing what and when. And so it's very important immediately following everyone agreeing that a decision was made okay, how are we going to communicate this? Who's doing what and when? And that's also when the best person, based off of the course of action chosen, should be designated as the implementer. So if there's 2 or 3 recommendations as courses of action, it may not be one person that would be best to implement each of those. And so it's really, how's this going to be communicated? When? And then also, who's the best based on this actual decision to drive it forward and implement it? And without that, it just starts to lead to some chaos, some resistance, and so forth.
Yeah, I can just see the negative repercussions. And then if you repeat that, and that's sort of the way we do things, I can see where that would be very frustrating for folks who are involved in the process. So, and the other thing within your book that I really liked was the simplicity, even though there are 8 steps, but still the simplicity of your model for making a decision. And I think that very first one is so important because the examples you gave of Damon, or he gave in his company, where the process they go through up front with this first step often causes them to decide not to move forward with an idea. So I think that it would be really helpful for you to share what is that first step and what's involved in it.
Yeah, nicely said. It's really about defining the intent of the decision, that first step. And this is absolutely critical because if we don't start to get people aligned at step 1, then we may get several steps down the line and realize, oh, we are really talking about different things here. And so when we talk about the intent of the decision, it's really kind of what problem are we trying to solve by making a decision, or what opportunity are we trying to pursue? And if we're able to really clearly define that and then say, well, what's our current state? And what do we want our desired end state to look like? That's going to help us. And so, one piece of advice that I like to give my clients when we're talking about high impact decisions, really boil it down to one slide that you can put up in the beginning of kind of decision making process meetings and say, okay, everyone, let's remember this is the intent of the decision that we're trying to make. And that's going to make sure everyone's aligned, that you all have the same footing, and you can ensure that when you're gathering information and talking about options and prioritizing options and so forth, that you all completely understand the intent. And that is going to help you when you say, well, here's one potential course of action. Is that going to solve this? And is it going to be the best option to drive forward? Mm-hmm. So that intent statement is absolutely critical.
Could you give an example or two of what is that? What would that look like so that people get it in a concrete way?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's say, for example, a lot of organizations do employee engagement type of surveys. So let's say that we just got org-wide results back, and we see that 59% of our organization is saying that they're engaged, that they're actively engaged on a day-to-day basis. That would definitely give me heart palpitations if only 59% are engaged. And so we start talking about what we're going to do, and we need to make some decisions associated with increasing engagement. Well, we could talk all day long about how to get those numbers up. Hey, let's get those up to 85%. Here's some things that we could do. But we need to dig deeper than that. We need to say, well, why do we want to see those numbers higher? What is it about an engaged workforce that is going to benefit our organization, is going to, benefit everything? So sometimes we need to just dig a lot deeper to make sure that we're getting to the root cause versus treating these symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe we say, well, engaged workforce, one of the things really decreases, attrition. And so we want to retain our talent. We know that we have a very, very thorough hiring process, that we really do have the best talent out there and we don't want to lose them. And so maybe our focus of a decision for that really comes down to, we want to attract and retain the best workforce in our industry. And that could really be the intent, where when we're talking about the engagement survey numbers, that's one metric that supports that. So we need to make sure that we're focusing on the actual challenge. And when we talk about gathering data for that, the next thing that I'd want to look at is, well, what was our retention for our organization last year and the year before? I'd want to start looking at trends there and saying, are our assumptions correct that as our employee engagement numbers went down, that our retention also went down? And so then we may be able to start digging into specific areas of the employee engagement survey and saying, oh, this one's really bad. Only 39% thinks that we actively invest in developing them. And that is a problem, because research shows that actively investing and developing your employees increases engagement and tends to increase that retention.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that was a very long answer, but you really have to go deeper and deeper and deeper until you know that you're at that root cause of what you're trying to solve, and then gather additional data to support that. And it may become even bigger than what you initially thought it was.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm glad you went into that level of detail, because I think it helps us avoid looking at something superficially and making assumptions or drawing conclusions too quickly that, oh, that's the issue we need to resolve, when in fact, other information that we could gather can fill in those gaps. What are we doing? And even opening up other conversations to have. Once you've got results of a survey like that, to me, that's like the beginning. Then you can open up dialogue to get people to talk about, what is it? Because we can assume, oh, if we added, a gym, or other kinds of benefits, that's going to do it. Well, it probably won't. It's so much more around the culture and how people feel about being a part of the workforce. And so I think that's an excellent example of where you've got data, you've identified an issue, but to understand how to really address it and see what the gap is, taking that time to do that further analysis, I think is really valuable.
I couldn't agree more. And what we don't want to do is take one data point and just start running with it. I feel like that's where we get a lot of those knee-jerk, I'll call it flavor of the week initiatives. We really need to look at things holistically. And, another example, let's say that our, employee engagement survey came back and 95% of our employees say, I'm actively engaged, I love working here, but we're at less than 50% retention. Something doesn't match up there. Something is wrong with those numbers. And so are people not being honest in our employee engagement survey? And if so, why? Oh, because they're getting divided down to the manager level, and most managers have 3 people that report to them. So they're going to know exactly who said what in there. And employees aren't being honest for that reason. So I've seen where sometimes people will grab a data point and just run with it, trying to solve that. But we need to be really broad thinkers. And one of the techniques that we talk about in the book to continue to drill into the real problem is asking why. And usually by the 5th time you ask that, you're getting to the real challenge. So why are employee engagement survey numbers important? Well, why? And then we ultimately get to, well, that's what we're trying to solve right there. It's not, the surface level type of stuff.
Yeah, that makes such a difference. Well, another aspect of decision making to me is around how we spend our time. And that these days, so many leaders are pressed for time with so many things to do. And I know that's one of your areas of passion and expertise is helping people figure out how to really maximize the time that they have. And I don't know that time management is the right word, managing yourself, managing your priorities, but talk a little bit about some of the things that would help someone think through how can I become more effective in the use of my time?
This is such a great topic. And I wish I had a little magic bottle that I could just pour more hours or minutes into my day. And I think a lot of leaders do, because this is the one thing that you just can't get back.
Yeah.
And when we talk about decision making, and I bet some people are gasping, thinking about an 8-step process. If I go through an 8-step decision making process, I'm never going to be able to get stuff done. That's why we say, well, there's a lot of great tidbits in our book that are just something to think about. There should be decisions that you make quickly throughout the day that aren't as high of impact. So we
Mhm.
really want to reserve the 8-step process and all of the things that we talk about for the higher impact decisions, because you should not just be making those off the cuff. And we're often asked, well, how do you define a high impact decision? That's going to be different for every organization. We can't put a dollar amount on it. We can't put a number of employees on it, because really a high impact decision to a small business may not be a high impact decision to a larger business, and so forth.
Mhm.
So we really say, well, if you're looking forward and you say in a year from now, this decision is going to have made us better or maybe worse, then yes, I would definitely consider that a high impact decision. When we're talking about something with lasting impact or
Mhm.
effect, then definitely high impact. So back to your original question, which is really that time management. I love to say, and anyone that knows me hears me say this, I think that leaders are time bankrupt. And it really comes down to, having too many things on our to-do list each day. And we have to say, well, what's most important? What's going to give myself and the organization the most value for where I'm investing my time? And what's not going to get done today? And we have to constantly be reprioritizing, saying the things at the top of the list are adding the most value. And we also need to help our teams do that, which can be a struggle sometimes, because maybe there's a passion project they love doing, but it's not adding a ton of value to the organization right here and now. And we need to help them shift their focus. Um, I was just laughing the other day. There's this newer commercial, or I've seen it for the first time, where it's got a monster and it's made out of sticky notes. I don't know if you've seen it yet, Meredith. It's made out of just total sticky notes, like Post-it notes. And this monster is walking around, and they talk about it being the to-do list monster.
Mhm.
And I think it's so cute because I was able to really connect with that commercial. And it's talking about, saving time or making time for yourself. And I think that we just have to realize that we have to figure out what works best for us with our scheduling, with prioritizing. And when we're talking about making high impact decisions, we need to schedule time to think on our calendars. So we're not trying to do that in between meetings or in the evening or at 2 a.m, which I often do if I haven't invested enough thought into something.
That is so true. We make time for meetings. We don't always make time for ourselves for that thinking time. And I think sometimes because we're so focused on doing, to not appear busy feels weird. We might even feel guilty about taking that time. And yet, you're so right. It's so critical to being effective. in our roles and making better decisions when we can think clearly and not have our brains so cluttered.
I find my best thinking time is generally when I'm away on vacation. And so my husband and I, we went to Southeast Asia. We had a fantastic, couple of weeks away earlier this year. Thailand, one of my favorites. I love Phuket. And it's really interesting when you get out of that just day to day grind. I'm always really anxious when I'm getting ready to go out on vacation, thinking like, oh, everything's going to burn down while I'm gone or whatnot, or I'm going to do all this work while I'm there. And usually a couple of days in, I realize, you know what? Things are fine. And I was caught up in that busy work cycle. And that's where I'm able to say, not important. Actually, I'm going to kill that initiative. This is really important. And I'm not making enough time for this and so forth. So I am able to reprioritize and set direction when I'm out of that day-to-day grind. And like I said, for me, it's vacation, but I highly, highly encourage leadership teams to set time aside together and do something offsite for usually a couple of days, maybe even 3 days, because by that first day away, you're usually winding down and probably still engaging in a lot of the emails and so forth. By day 2, I find that a lot of leaders start peaking regarding their creativity and the innovation and really being invested in being offsite and talking about what's most important. So that's critical. I highly recommend that at least once to twice a year that leaders get away and get that time together to think and reprioritize.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like you had some other things on your recent vacation in terms of ahas with your own self-care when we were talking earlier. And I'd love for you to share that because I think that's relevant for all of us.
I'm a true believer that as a leader, you're not being the best that you can unless you're taking care of yourself. And I had definitely fallen into that slippery slope where I found myself, sitting at my desk, just trying to power through out of sheer willpower to get stuff done. And sometimes 12 plus days where I'd find out or I'd look at my watch, which is a blessing and a curse sometimes, that I'd barely gotten up and moved. I was not exercising properly, refueling myself properly and so forth. And so being away and on vacation and really active, walking miles and miles each day and, just relaxing, I noticed a significant increase in my physical and mental health. It was just one of those aha moments, as you said, where I realized I need to reevaluate my day to day, my schedule. How am I starting out my day? Am I scheduling or making time for healthy meals? Am I making time to exercise and spend time with my family and so forth? And so since coming back from that vacation, I have done a lot of kind of finagling my schedule so that I can be the best that I can be. And I think that my team's noticed it. I know my husband's noticed it because we've talked about, so kind of getting back to taking care of yourself, which in turn, it really makes you a better leader.
Mm-hmm. For someone who's been having their nose to the grindstone and not been able to get away and take that fresh look, what is something they might do differently to get that perspective and kind of start focusing more on that self-care that may have been put on the back burner?
There's never a good time to take vacation. I truly believe that. I used to say, schedule a vacation and you're guaranteed to get a new signed contract in, which is great. It's great, but it usually happens right before you go out. And then it's, trying to figure out, hey, I had protected and blocked this time. And now I'm going to need to maybe break into it a little bit to still move things forward. But please take your vacation, schedule it, do it, delegate. Sometimes we're not as critical as we think we are. And if we absolutely are going to make or break our team or our organization, then we probably aren't delegating as well as we could be. So take the vacation, get away, reset. If you're able to just completely unplug, I think that's a good thing. For me, I like to stay maybe 5% engaged when I'm on vacation. I do occasional reading and responding of emails, but try to set that time aside. And I'm big also. This is a little bit different because I talk about logical decision making, but I'm also big into kind of manifestation. And if we're not putting out into the universe what we want to get back as far as goals, lifestyle, and so forth, then it doesn't really know what to give us. And so use that time when you're away to think about where you want to be as a leader in 6 months, in a year, in 5 years. Where do you see your family? Where do you see yourself? And then actually work towards that. So if we're not doing that, we're kind of just cruising along and any road's going to get us there, where it's more beneficial to take a specific path. And that's extra important when we're talking about where do we want to be with our career, because it's not always someone wanting to go from individual contributor to manager to senior manager to, C-level. Some people don't want to be in management, and that's okay. But we need to know what we want to do for ourselves. And that helps us communicate it, because a lot of times if we ask someone for help or we're verbalizing what we want, it's going to help us get there even quicker.
I so agree with you on the taking vacation time, and also just taking time in the course of a day, to take a vacation break in your head, to step away. Because I'm like you, I can sit at my desk and lose track of the time and realize, oh, I really ought to get up and move around and take a break. Because especially when you enjoy what you're doing, it can be something to really have to become more self-aware and more conscious of. And I think that taking those breaks, budgeting or blocking off that thinking time is so, so important. It's just as equally important as the doing and accomplishing of results. Because what I have found is when I do take the time to do that, I get more done because I have greater clarity about where I'm going, what I want to get done in whatever period of time it is. It makes such a difference. One final thing, there's so much we could talk about, but one of the other things in your book that I really liked, and it was the example with your sister relocating and where was she going to move, because you made an important distinction, I think, that really is valuable for decision making. And that is not just having a pros and cons list, but having your criteria and then narrowing your focus and weighing each one of those elements to determine how much weight do I want to give this in my decision, so they're not equally weighted. Talk a little bit about that and why it's important.
Great question. And criteria, it's really what must be included in this course of action for us to be successful. And so when we talk about decision-making criteria, there's a lot of different ways that you can approach that. So we talk a lot about a decision-making matrix in our book, and we actually have a free version of that in Excel, where you could go in and you could list your decision-making criteria, and then you can weight it, and then you can evaluate each of your courses of action, and really compare it against that criteria. So when we're talking about criteria, let's pretend we're going to buy a house. And we know what's on our, wish list regarding that buying a house. For me, a fenced-in backyard is an absolute must-have. And so if it doesn't already have a fence or doesn't have the ability, doesn't have the land or the layout to where you could put up a fence, that's a hard deal breaker for me. And, definitely want, a kitchen that we can entertain, maybe fit 8 to 10 people in there while we're cooking. So it's really about what are the must-haves associated with this decision. And another type of thing that I like to put out there. So there's something in project management. It's called Moscow, and it's often abbreviated MSCW, which stands for must have, should have, could have, and won't have. And so if we're able to categorize that criteria, some of them may be nice to have. That's a best case scenario. While some of the other ones may be must haves. And then there's some things that may come up when we're getting input from people where they're going to say, are we including this in the course of action? And if we say no, it's going to go on the won't have list. So it's not just about saying what must be included in this. We could also say, well, what should be included, what could be included, and what won't be included. And that allows us to look at the decision objectively. And when we're having conversations with some of our stakeholders or people providing input or people impacted by the decision, we were really clear on what success looks like.
I think that's so valuable, just again, in getting clarity, because I think that's so much of what needs to happen with decisions is, and that's why I loved your first step so much. Where is it we want to be at the end of this? What's the result? What problem is this going to take away? That kind of emphasis so that it clears the way for the other steps. And I just think that's so powerful. So is there anything else I haven't asked you about, Kandis, that has occurred to you as we've been talking that you think, oh, I'd like to share this one more thing?
I will kind of tie together a couple of things we've talked about, the time management and the decision making. I just want to reinforce that there's something called decision fatigue. And if we're going about making loads and loads of decision on a day-to-day basis or a week-to-week basis, we may want to say, should we as leaders be making all of these decisions? Or are there some decisions that are on our plate that we can successfully delegate and be really clear, talking to some of our managers and say, you know what? I support you. I trust you. And from now on, I want you to make decisions associated with XYZ. Empowering the people below us to do that is a real motivator when it comes to leaders that report to us. And so if you're finding yourself just run down, making loads and loads of decisions, determine if you can delegate some of those. That way, your time is focused on the most important and highest impact decisions. That's where we want to be focused. And that's where we want to be setting aside our time so that we can think through those. So scheduling our day to where we can minimize the number of decisions we're making and ensure that we're focused at the right level or highest impact decisions for our position within a team or an organization is critical.
That's so important. Thank you for bringing that up, because I think sometimes we can be exhausted at the end of the day without realizing how many times we've had to make decisions, and being able to let go of some of those can be such a relief. And as you say, it really helps the people we're delegating to, because then they feel that they are having greater impact. They're able to use their brains more effectively. And I just think the ripple effect of that leads to that higher engagement and greater commitment and retention of people when they feel like they are each being challenged and given opportunities to grow and learn. Because I agree with you and what you said earlier about that's what people really are looking for. They don't want to just stay and do the same old for any period of time. So Kandis, tell us where people can get a copy of your wonderful book. Again, Good Decisions Equal Success, and connect with you and learn more about the great work you're doing.
Yes, thank you, Meredith. The best place to go and order the book is on Amazon. And so feel free to just give it a search as far as Good Decisions Equal Success. And as far as connecting with me, you can connect with me on LinkedIn, Kandis Porter. And also, I have a YouTube channel. So if you search my name on YouTube, I've got a channel. It's primarily focused on project management. And we do talk a lot about decisions because, as you can imagine, when you're managing a project, there's a lot of decisions associated with that.
Mhm.
But as I pointed out earlier, oftentimes there is a project that's chartered because of a high impact decision that was previously made. So
Yes.
look forward to connecting.
Great. Well, we'll make sure we put that YouTube channel on the show notes page. And Candace, I want to just thank you so much for not just what you're doing, but who you are. I just love your energy and your expertise. You've brought together so many years of experience, lessons learned over time, and now you're having such a great positive impact in the organizations you're working with. Thank you so much for how you show up and also all that you do to make a difference and help people not just make decisions, but run their organizations for maximum effectiveness.
Thank you so much for having me, Meredith. And you said it best. When you love what you do, it really shows up. And I love what I do. So I appreciate you having me.
Yes, thank you. I can tell you do. And it's great that you are here today to share that with my audience.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into my podcast. Now head over to growstrongleaders.com and check out our 2 books, Connect with Your Team and Peer Coaching Made Simple. While you're there, download the free facilitator guide to find out how to implement our unique peer coaching system. Until next time, I'm Meredith Bell.